The movie begins with Mason, a former Marine who longs to return to the days of the past, when his life was full of action and he felt he had a purpose. Now he is just a boring lawyer who works 9 to 5, with a wife who despises him and many memories stored in a box that he longs to relive. The only spark of happiness is his daughter, Chase, whom he loves madly. He teaches her how to defend herself against bullies using his old army tactics, since years ago he gave up his dream job to join the military. Now he has to settle for being a low-level attorney, handling phone fraud cases that a child could solve. That afternoon at the office, he receives a visit from an old friend and companion, Sebastian, who seems to have a proposal for him. The latter takes him to an airbase full of equipment and soldiers, where Mason feels more than happy to see everything he was once a part of. There they spend some time reminiscing about the old days. It is then that Sebastian offers him a job as a personal bodyguard, telling him it's something simple that he could do without any problems, even after his years of inactivity. On top of that, the pay is $2,000. Sebastian gives him one day to think about it. So when Mason returns to his boring life, his mind can't stop telling him that this is the opportunity he's been waiting for. He just needs to figure out a way to tell his wife without her getting upset. But his luck takes a turn when his wife tells him she's tired of seeing how the man she loved has become someone boring and without any passion for life. At that moment, she asks him for a divorce. Devastated, Mason decides that it's time to straighten out his life and accepts the job without telling his wife. The next morning, he meets Claire, his client, who is a journalist famous for her boldness and the woman he must keep safe. On the way, Claire tells him she has an interview with the president of Palonia, a man branded a ruthless dictator who runs a country in crisis. His name is Juan Arturo Venegas, and they will travel there for the interview. Mason is somewhat nervous about the job because in the past his last mission was to assassinate Juan Arturo Venegas, and not only did they fail, but half of his friends died in the confrontation. Now he has to escort Claire to meet him, just like that. The plane arrives in Palonia, and we finally meet Arturo, who exudes confidence and has no fear of flirting with Claire at every moment of the welcome, even though he's somewhat childish and egocentric. However, he's very clever, as he seems to know everything about Mason and Claire's lives, so it would be a mistake to take him for a fool. The caravan moves through the city, and we clearly see that the president has set up quite a show to convince Claire that people are happy, although some aren't afraid to show what they really feel about Arturo Venegas. A few minutes later, while they are heading to the presidential ranch, they come to a bridge where a sort of blockade has been set up. Seconds later, the first car in the caravan is hit and a shootout breaks out. Claire, unable to believe what's happening, yells at Mason to help her, but he is frozen in the back seat, paralyzed by his years out of service. The man is stunned by the scene. Luckily, after a few seconds, he snaps out of it, takes control of the SUV, and faces off against the rebels with it. When he finally defeats them, he realizes that there are no vehicles left to escape in, so they must flee into the jungle to get away from the rebels, who will surely arrive soon. Mason's plan is to return to the airport and leave Palonia as soon as possible. Claire, on the other hand, is tempted to chase the story, but after a few minutes she agrees to leave the country. Arturo, with no other options, decides to go with them. Once they're far enough away from the attack zone, Mason calls Sebastian, who locates him with GPS and tells him to continue east while he coordinates a helicopter rescue. Using the same phone, Arturo calls George, his nephew, who already had everything set up to announce himself as the new president of Palonia, revealing that he is the one behind the attack. After the call, Arturo, who knows his nephew perfectly, realizes that George is hiding something, so he hangs up before they can trace him. Then he asks Mason and Claire for help in reaching the capital, but Mason refuses and leaves him behind in the jungle. A few hours later, they reach the place Sebastian indicated, but everything changes when they see that the helicopter is a combat helicopter, and several armed soldiers get off. Mason, knowing something is wrong, runs into the jungle while the helicopter follows and opens fire. After several minutes fleeing through the jungle, they finally lose track of the soldiers, giving Mason the opportunity to use the rifle he took from Arturo's caravan. This is where his skills resurface, and he manages to hit the pilot, but the helicopter was already headed in his direction. They have to flee to avoid being crushed by the plummeting aircraft. Because of the helicopter crash, Claire panics and gets separated from Mason. Unfortunately, the soldiers have followed her trail, and her only option is to hide. Fortunately, the ex-Marine appears just in time to stop the soldiers from killing Claire. But there comes a moment when he is distracted, and the last of the soldiers surprises him. In an unexpected twist, Arturo appears at the perfect moment and shoots the soldier in the back, saving the protagonist from certain death. Back at the crashed helicopter, George has arrived with more soldiers. That's where we meet Colonel Jan, his partner in this attack, who represents several American clients with interests in Palonia. George is upset about his failure, but the colonel shows him who the real man of action is and who the rich kid without courage is. A few hours later in the jungle, Mason and Claire begin to piece things together. It turns out Arturo never really scheduled an interview. They told him he had to do it to improve his image at the UN, and Mason would be used as a scapegoat for the president's murder. After walking a long distance, Arturo leads them to his hometown, where there are still people who love him and are willing to help. There, Claire takes the opportunity to have an honest interview with Arturo, in which she learns that for years he has defended his country, not from other governments, but from multinational energy companies. These companies have discovered a rare metal in their lands that will revolutionize the creation of chips and technologies. Since he has refused to sell it for a pittance, these corporations have targeted him. The next morning, Mason takes another risk by using the phone to call and confront Sebastian, who tells him that the real plan was to kill Arturo at his ranch. But George beat them to it. They can still salvage the deal and earn more money if Mason kills Arturo, so the corporations can have their mineral, allowing him to return home a rich man. Faced with this situation, Mason understands why Sebastian chose him. He knew Mason wouldn't hesitate to kill the man responsible for the deaths of half his unit years ago. But now Mason must decide what to do. Meanwhile, the colonel has arrived at the first village, and Mason must delay his decision until they are safe. His priority is to get out alive. Since cars are not an option for them at the moment, the group flees on horseback. However, Claire has no experience and after a few minutes fails to keep up the pace, allowing the soldiers to catch up with her. Because of this, Mason must choose what to do. He can kill Arturo and return to America, where his payment and his family await, or he can work with him to reach the capital, where they will try to save Claire and Palonia. Surprisingly, Arturo already knew all of this, and reveals that the mission in which Mason's friends died was a conspiracy. There were explosives in the tail of the helicopter, and they used the news of a war against the United States to force Arturo to give up part of his land to the corporations. Now that these corporations know the value of the land, they are not satisfied with just a portion. They want the entire country for themselves. When they arrive at a nearby town, we see that Arturo still has some friends there. That's when he asks for their support in an exchange he will make with the colonel. A few hours later, Mason meets with the colonel to exchange Claire for Arturo. The moment of the exchange arrives, but the president still has a few tricks up his sleeve and shows up with hundreds of people, causing a massive commotion in which the protagonists manage to escape. Later, using a secret passage that only the president knows about, they arrive at his office, where George is getting comfortable, believing he is the new leader of Palonia. Fortunately, he's just a naive young man and quickly regrets what he's done, begging his uncle for forgiveness. However, one of his generals is not so willing to see Arturo. In a sudden move, he fires at him, while Claire is streaming everything on her phone. The bullet doesn't injure Arturo because his suit is bulletproof. George isn't so lucky and collapses in front of everyone. The young man dies in his uncle's arms after asking for forgiveness again for his actions. A few seconds later, Palonia's military forces enter the room and threaten Arturo, who only has something to say before being killed. The colonel's forces also burst into the room, and after Arturo convinces his army to support him against the American mercenaries, a huge firefight ensues. The mercenaries quickly take down the soldiers, forcing the protagonist to flee through the secret passage and hide in the palace, where a war has erupted between the mercenaries and Palonia's forces. To buy Arturo and Claire some time to escape, Mason stays behind and encounters the colonel during the fight. The colonel thinks he will prevail, So he confesses to Mason that he was the one who planned the attack on his friends. Surprisingly, Claire appears from behind and strikes the colonel in the throat, giving Mason enough time to finish him off. The mercenaries keep arriving, and Palonia's forces do not seem strong enough to stop them. Seconds later, Mason is out of breath and grabs a gun to keep fighting. But even with his help, things won't end well for them. Luckily, Sebastian has decided to do the right thing and shows up with reinforcements. Now the old comrades are ready to fight side by side again, causing the mercenaries to be decimated with no choice but to retreat. A few days after the intense battle, the footage Claire streamed on her phone is on every news channel in the world, so Arturo now has UN support to stand against those trying to take his country from him. At home, Mason's wife sees her husband alongside the president of a nation on national television. He has regained his shine, and she realizes she still loves him passionately. So when the man returns home, she is happy to have a second chance with him. Later that day, Mason gets a notification from his bank, and upon visiting an ATM, discovers there are $5 million in his account. A small gift from Arturo for his services. The movie ends with Mason regaining his confidence and passion for life as he spends his days enjoying with his family the fruits of his efforts.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.